There's a moment in every historian's journey when you stumble across something so submerged beneath the usual narratives that it forces you to rethink what you thought you knew about the Second World War. Most people close the book in 1945, satisfied with the familiar conclusion of victory parades and reconstruction. But anyone who spends enough time digging knows that the war didn't end when the treaties were signed. It seeped into the soil, the forests, the displaced camps, and the secret detainment sites scattered across Europe. What I want to walk you through today is one of those shadows history rarely brings into the light, not because it isn't important, but because the people who lived it carried the trauma quietly, and the governments involved preferred silence. This is a story that sits beneath the polished textbooks, the story of what waited for millions once the guns fell silent. If you stay with me for the next few minutes, you'll understand why this atrocity stayed hidden for decades, and why learning it now changes how we read the post-war world. Let's talk about what truly happened in the aftermath, when peace was signed but violence didn't stop. Most people know about the liberation of concentration camps and the return of soldiers, but far fewer are aware that the end of the war brought about one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans, many of them civilians who had lived for generations in places like Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia and Romania, were expelled from their homes. These were not orderly relocations. They were marches in dead winter, train transports with no sanitation or food, and detainment in makeshift camps where disease and starvation claimed hundreds of thousands. What made these events so unspeakable to survivors was the sense of being punished for crimes they never committed simply because of their ancestry. This isn't revisionism. It's a documented part of European history that was buried under political tensions and national shame. Understanding how governments justified these expulsions helps us see why they were erased. The Allies, still reeling from the atrocities uncovered in Germany, accepted the argument from Eastern European governments that removing ethnic Germans would prevent future uprisings or nationalist movements. But when you read testimonies from people who survived, you see a different reality, one that reveals how quickly vengeance can transform into abuse of power. Thousands were rounded up not for military involvement, but because they occupied property that new authorities wanted. In places like the Sudetenland, expulsions were preceded by public humiliations, forced labour and spontaneous executions carried out by militias whose members had suffered under Nazi rule and now took justice into their own hands. It's one of the hardest truths to swallow, that even victims of occupation can become perpetrators once structures collapse. What matters for history buffs and survival-minded viewers is understanding how these power vacuums work. When a political order collapses, the rules don't simply reset. They dissolve, leaving pockets of authority controlled by whoever organizes force first. For those studying survival and conflict transitions, these expulsions offer insight into what happens when systems fail and civilians are caught between governments, occupying forces and militias. A practical way to apply this knowledge is to study the early indicators of institutional breakdown. For example, when local security forces begin operating outside official channels, when civilian populations are categorized as collective threats, or when property redistribution becomes tied to ethnicity rather than law, you're looking at the same mechanisms that led to these post-war atrocities. Mapping these signs today, whether in historical simulations, academic research, or geopolitical analysis, allows you to anticipate outcomes before they fully unfold. Another hidden layer comes from the detainment camps set up after the war. Many people assume all internment camps closed with the defeat of the Third Reich, but the reality is more complicated. In several countries across Central and Eastern Europe, camps originally built by the Nazis were repurposed to detain ethnic Germans and political opponents. Some were operated by local authorities, others by Soviet forces. Mortality rates in certain camps reached staggering levels because administrations lacked experience, resources, or restraint. When you study the records, you find that disease outbreaks, forced labour, and executions were not rare anomalies. These camps remained largely unspoken in the West because the emerging Cold War demanded unified narratives, not stories that complicated alliances. There's a reason this matters to serious historians. You cannot understand the Cold War without understanding this silence. The post-war expulsions and camp systems created lasting resentments that shaped political identities for decades. Families displaced in 1945 formed powerful advocacy groups in West Germany. Meanwhile, Eastern governments suppressed discussion to avoid undermining their moral authority in relation to Nazi crimes. When historians avoid topics because they feel, too messy, the result is a distorted understanding of how societies heal, or, don't heal, after mass trauma. Diving into this material gives you, a more complete map of Europe's psychological landscape as it entered the Cold War. For anyone interested in practical history, there's another takeaway: how ordinary people survived forced displacement. Survivor accounts provide techniques still relevant for modern crisis scenarios. Families learned to travel in tight units, not split up, because fragmented groups rarely reenacted. They cached valuables in multiple hidden locations, knowing guards confiscated anything visible. They formed micro-communities inside trains and camps to pool skills. One person bartered, another kept watch, another tracked ration patterns to locate weaknesses in guard routines. These weren't heroic cinematic feats. They were the quiet strategies that kept people alive in systems designed to break them. If you study these patterns carefully, you begin to see universal survival principles. Move early, travel light, diversify resources, build alliances fast, and observe everything. Bringing atrocities like these into the open isn't about rewriting blame. It's about restoring the historical record. When you combine archival research, survivor testimony, and geopolitical context, the picture is clear. Something enormous happened after the Second World War that doesn't fit neatly into victory narratives. If you want to understand the real consequences of war, the kind that outlast treaties, you must study what happened in the shadows between 1945 and 1949. That's where the human story continues. If this gave you something new to think about, make sure you subscribe, share this with other history enthusiasts, and keep pushing for the chapters of history that still deserve a voice.